Welcome to the Human, who are we? Center
Cafe.
for Archival Futures speaker series, and this is our second, and it's been very well received. We're really delighted to have everybody here, and we meet once a month, the first Wednesday of every month at 4 p.m. The schedules are available, but we also have our own website. You can go and see what we're up to, which is pretty straightforward, cafe.umd.edu. So I'd like to introduce Eric Hung, who's on our team at Cafe, one of our team members. And he recommended that we invite Umi Siu to speak with us today. So I'm going to let him tell us why he thought she would be a good match for us.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Eric Hong, and I teach at the iSchool, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Umi Siu. I've known Umi, at least in reputation, for over 10 years. When their advisor introduced their research to me, I think we met maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And we're both sort of escaped musicologists working in the public humanities. So Umi Siu is a public humanist and strategic designer with research and organizing agendas for equity in the arts, technology, and civic life. They're currently the director of content strategy at One Archives Foundation. Previously, Xiu led digital and data initiatives at the City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs. They teach as adjunct faculty at the Art Center College of Design and the USC Marshall School of Business, and have published extensively on digital media, data, and internet culture. As a sound ethnographer and artist, Xiu has received fellowships and awards from the National Endowment for the Arts, American Council for Learned Society, Shuttleworth Foundation, and LA Metro, and has works presented by the Ruhr Museum, the Japanese American National Museum, and the CTM Festival in Berlin. So please welcome Dr. Siu, and please keep yourself muted during the presentation, but feel free to add your questions to the chat at any time. So Dr. Siu.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's been a pleasure sort of intersecting with you over the course of my professional trajectory in a couple of different ways, and I'm just loving all the overlaps. It's my pleasure to be here talking to y'all. I'm based in Southern California in Los Angeles on Tomva land, and it is a strange day because it is raining here, which is a thing. It's an event. I would just say that my name is Umi Siu, and I use they, them pronouns. And I will be giving you a talk about what I do today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and set up the closed captions. Give me 1 second. Okay. How does it look? Thumbs up? Great. Thank you. All right. So here we go. So, as Eric mentioned, I have a background in ethnomusicology as a sound ethnographer, ethnomusicologist, with a concentration in digital humanities, and that was what I did for graduate school and post-grad for a little while. It wasn't too long ago. I was out in the field researching sort of soundscape and acoustic qualities of urban spaces in post-colonial Taiwan and East LA. I still do this work, mostly shifting my focus on thinking more broadly about public hearing, public listening, sort of sound studies in a civic context. That is not the talk I'm giving today. My transition, so just a little bit more about me, my transition into the public humanities began in the public sector and the cultural sector as well, thanks to the ACLS Public Fellowship Program. I started working at the City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs in 2013, leading digital and data strategy, directing the creation of digital archives, cultural asset mapping projects, as well as an interesting virtual reality tour of a Frank Lloyd Wright building that's managed by this city. As Eric mentioned, I now work as Director of Content Strategy at a nonprofit called One Archives Foundation. And just a little bit about One Archives Foundation. I joined One Archives Foundation in October 2019, so just a few months before the start of the pandemic. The organization started in 1952, first as a publisher of One magazine, as One Inc., One Incorporated. The founders of the organization were very interested in the notion of publishing as a way to bring together the lesbian, gay, subsequently transgender, and the rest of the LGBTQ communities together through publishing. The founders were also interested in this notion of using education as a means to bring awareness into the community. And so it became One Institute and started offering classes in what they call the homophile studies. And that was something that lasted from the 60s into the 80s. And the One Archives Foundation's founders were also very much into this notion of collecting historical artifacts to the extent of doing dumpster diving, where queer individuals who passed away had left behind their belongings, and that they knew that those belongings would actually be discarded by family members who were not accepting of them. So then they took the extra effort into collecting and preserving these objects as ephemera that tell LGBTQ stories. One Archives Foundation is now an independent nonprofit organization working in partnership with USC Libraries. In 2010, One Archives Foundation gifted the collections of archival materials to the USC Libraries, and that they are the maintainer of these physical objects, while One Archives Foundation, the nonprofit, works programmatically in collaboration and coordination with USC Libraries, putting on exhibitions and education programming. So today, the talk that I'll be giving centers around this question, with two questions. Just what is the role of content in public humanities work? And how do we produce meaningful archive-based content when human attention is traded like a currency? These questions will frame what I talk about today. Specifically, I'm thinking about sort of the tension between kind of this long-form content work that I've learned to do in graduate school as a humanities scholar, and sort of this pressing need to kind of generate, produce, and publish, engage with the present moment, with the public, and how sort of the media and information ecosystem sort of cycles through in a really fast, rapid way in our current day. And I'll be mostly talking about my work drawn from One Archives Foundation. 90% of the data that's been created since the beginning of humankind were actually generated in just the last 2 years. And that's mostly internet user data. We're now living in an attention economy. What does that mean? We're living in an age when our attention is scarce. What's most valuable in our current formation of information is, in fact, our attention. Human attention is now a form of scarcity. It's something to be sought after, to be traded. Attention is what we put our mind to. So you could be sitting here while thinking about your lunch, or I guess if you're on the East Coast, you would be thinking about maybe dinner at this point. It's your dinner that owns your attention, essentially. You can be thinking about how to respond to an Instagram post that you just put up, that Instagram post, in fact, owns your attention. And systematically, or in terms of just organizationally how that works, is that Instagram as a company owns your attention. And that your attention is being spent as a product, something to be traded. Noise. You must recognize this. Neon Cat. Favorite meme just a while ago, actually probably eons ago in terms of internet age. What it does is its cuteness captures the attention of people, and this meme has gone around the internet globally. We check our cell phone 46 times a day on average. I read somewhere that that number has gone up to be about 96 times a day. Whatever happens on the cell phone is determined and designed to grab our attention. These apps are designed to want us to crave more of our attention. Our attention could be weaponized for political power, monetized for profit, or even valorized for cultural power. How do you get more out of a user? How do you get more attention out of them? A slot machine was used as a part of a user experience study. So the way this works is that the user experience researchers realized that there is something intrinsic in the design of a slot machine. It's the motion of pulling down the lever, letting it go, and that it creates a sense of anticipation. That anticipation subsequently sets up the expectation for more. So in just the design in itself, regardless of what you pull and the results of the slot machine instance, there is more attention to be desired just in that motion. What happened was user experience designers learned that there is a cognitive and sort of behavioral connection between pulling the lever and our sense of suspense and this anticipation, that they integrated it into the design of our email apps. How many of you have subconsciously sort of pull your screen down just as a way to refresh your email inbox and don't really think about that you're doing that and anticipate for more? I saw Beth raising. Okay, so great. Yeah, thank you for responding. So that intentional design is there to want us to give more attention to the design. Okay. $2 billion account. How many of you have heard about that recently, as in early January? The famous person's account that was worth $2 billion. Thanks, Eric. I don't know if I should mobilize the chat as a way so I can see how people are answering. Let me see about doing that. That may be interesting. Okay, all right. So I just turned on the chat if you want to chat at me. Somebody said they haven't heard the $2 billion account. All right, so here's the deal. Advertising analysts estimated that Trump's Twitter account was worth $2 billion. This valuation is based on the amount of attention Trump's Twitter account and its content attract. It was also a point of debate as for whether his account should have been suspended because of that, because of the valuation, the monetary valuation. I know some of you probably think that you're done listening about him. Particularly from Twitter as a company, it was a decision that they had to make, weighing the integrity of their content policy against the value of one of their most influential and trafficked user accounts. There was a debate in terms of this valuation. However, Twitter stock dropped 6% after the account was suspended, but it recovered shortly So the question of the value still remains. In addition to the atomization of the self as a social condition that we live in, so the fact that we're sort of split, like our attention is split, our mind is having to sort of be placed on lots of different things, objects, media, design products, apps, technologies. In this current economy, there are some interesting questions about content that are being raised. Humanity's stuff, the things that we generate as humanists, manifests content as content in the current economy. So that means, that's the publishable publications that we have. It's also, if you're somebody who builds sort of infrastructures and systems of information in archival databases or analytical output of archival elements, all of those things are considered to be content. And that's the stuff that we work with as humanists, right? I mean, that is content in the sort of broad, very, very broad sense of the word in the current information economy. This is not necessarily the stuff that academic humanists produce. Like, there's a huge difference between a social media post, obviously, and, a full sort of full-length monograph that's produced as a printed book. But certainly writers, journalists, content makers are the creators of humanistic content, and that all that work, all that output is being put through this sort of evaluative lens of this attention economy. So content is squeezed into the boxes that are part of this this ecosystem where where things have been instrumentalized to maximize our attention as metrics. In other words, content is now a new advertisement, sadly. Okay. So how do companies find value in content in the current market? There is overall this trend within technology and information infrastructure in its development in contentization. Another sort of thing another way to approach content is that how do we turn things into content? So media companies and companies or publishers who previously weren't involved in producing content are now producing content. So you have, brand media companies becoming publishers. So like Netflix now, is now publishing and producing original content. You also have publishers that have traditionally been publishing kind of print media and now expanding to other kinds of multimedia content. So BuzzFeed, creative studio within BuzzFeed, New York Times has a creative studio. Other internet platforms are now morphing into content producing initiatives as well. There was an example of Yahoo, which acquired Tumblr, and not a whole lot happened after that, but LinkedIn is now actually really priding itself for producing sort of professional development content, such as like workshops and training and webinars. And this content business is sort of overall kind of taking over the ecosystem. And so in an information economy where everybody is presumed to be a researcher, the stuff that we research and what we use as information becomes a part of this sort of economic exchange. So information that's based on kind of the modularization of content production and consumption and delivery becomes all sort of instrumentalized by computation and internet data analytics. So this industry is actually worth like $313 billion as of 2019. So it's there's a whole lot of money in there. There was a sort of supply and demand. Demand is just what people are searching, what they would like. Supply is the information that's there, generated by users or not. And there's various formations of how this gets played out. Like, I'm not going to get super into the kind of business side, but I do want to know that it's just kind of make a case that, it is everywhere. It's in direct marketing, which, is social media advertisements. Direct marketing uses user-generated browsing content in order to target products embedded in social media channels. And that leads to sort of this like, brand awareness that you see, that's popping up on your social media interfaces, that sort of attract market leads into their websites. There's also kind of these ideas like about cryptocurrency sort of speculatively is now positioned as the next frontier, that cryptocurrency will be integrated with user-generated content platforms, meaning that all of the sort of things that we produce as users, all the social media posts that we put up there, eventually, there's going to be some sort of metric that's attached to the value of each object that's produced, so then you can actually, like, at one point, like, maybe make money from your content, sort of with this sort of interesting kind of like quote unquote democratization of content production. So that's the business. So how is that related to what I do? There's a giant typo. Ignore the typo on the slide. The attention economy, and the way that it works in the nonprofit sector, it has a few sort of like really tangible ways in which that touch on the work that I do on a daily basis. There's the sort of the brand versus mission. The work that I'm doing, is having to kind of get piped through all of the sort of channels, digital technological channels, in order to make sure that, that my organization's name, visual identity itself is known. And sometimes, there's sort of this like tension between like, do we put more resources into the brand versus actually doing the mission? There's also kind of the logic of, content marketing that's built into all of our communication tools. Like, so the idea that something is popular or getting many, many likes, it has a sort of seductive power that content is, more valued. It is weighed more monetarily, but whether it's weighed more culturally or historically is yet another question. There's also just a proliferation of content jobs. Like, the fact that I'm in a content job, my last job, was a digital job where I was able to kind of like learn all the sort of systems and technologies and the analytics of this type of work. And that is in fact influencing, just, what the opportunities are out there in terms of what people with humanities backgrounds could be doing. So those are the things that I think about. So given the speed at which we're having to meet content demand, like, in the sort of like 2021 technological speed, and we're also having to keep up with the goal of brand awareness, how can we create content that's meaningful still, given sort of the larger kind of like organizational mission that I have, working at One Arcast Foundation? Of course, that mission is preserving and telling stories related to the LGBTQ history and communities. How do we still do that work? In Jenny Odell's book, How to Do Nothing, which is a book that was gifted to me by an intern in my last job. I put it away because I felt like I didn't really need it. I understood all of what was in this book before reading it, but I picked it up recently, and it's really shaping how I'm thinking about what I do. Jenny Odell provocatively questions the amount of attention that we as 21st century internet users spend on digital media. She gives an account of how our minds suffer from how our attention is fractured by the sort of metricalizing of internet media, splitting, fracturing. She notes how prolonged periods of engagement with low resolution media, so things that we're seeing now on the internet, just a few pixels at a time, right? As opposed to a lived person with material existence in front of us, how sort of this engagement with low resolution media causes stress and detriment to our cognitive ability to focus. Instead, she advocates for deep engagement of nature as a way to restore our cognitive and mental ability through a kind of her critical discussion of technology detox and late capitalist media consumption. Jenny Odell talks about how internet media often are served without context and argues for the value of context to be restored in contemporary life. And this is what she says. Context is what happens when you hold your attention open for long enough. The longer you hold it, the more context appears. So this is my provocation. Context as a container. Over the last year or so, I began thinking about what I do as a content strategist and the content strategy that I do as a kind of a container to put our minds in, so then our minds can stretch and expand without being harmed or subject to distraction and attention scarce environment. This design strategy has cognitive, emotional, and ethical implications. Excuse me while I drink some water. Context as a container is defined by embodied and affective qualities. So it has the, so it touches on how we feel in our body and in our minds and emotionally. It creates possibilities for reconstituting reality and restoring wholeness. It recognizes partial truths and perspectives. It invites inquiries. Rather than compression, which the attention economy has a way of pressing down on our attention, splitting it by demand, it's the container that I'm suggesting is about expansion. The attention economy forces people to be fractured into relationships with objects, people, communities, texts, images, so on. To resist this fracturing of self and attention, I lean into the notion of context not only as a critical inquiry, which is what we're used to as humanities scholars, but also as a reparative container, not with the promise for wholeness, but a reminder of the partiality of our reality, a partiality of what we know, our knowledge, the partiality of what we experience, which is limited by the screen. This container is a gentle invitation to restore wholeness, to be experienced at the cognitive level, and hopefully also at the community level as a collective. In Rita Felske's book, The Limits of Critique, she talks about how history is not in a box. I just wanted to kind of make a little comment about that before we move on to the other things. What we're talking about are actually different kinds of boxes. Rita Felske's box that she sort of critiques is a sort of a scientific object-oriented ways of organizing historical materials based on time-based categories. So this is something that we're all really used to, and seeing it at the archive, you see sort of manifestations of boxes as containers that have placed sort of artifacts and ephemera into containers, that each container is a part of this sort of larger kind of cataloging system. So there is sort of object orientation of boxes that are organized based on time, and sometimes based on subject categories, sometimes based on formats and medium types. So that is not the kind of box that I'm talking about. And actually, I'm in total agreement with Rita Felsky. She actually says that there's a whole lot of value in sort of stretching the temporality in how we approach time, in how we approach history and historical materials, and especially content. What she's calling transtemporal approach in thinking about history. So the focus is not on discrete units of time and seeing time as objective reality. Instead, we're emphasizing the transtemporal ways of thinking about time and history that's much bigger. In fact, it's not the sort of acid-free box that we're talking about here. We're talking about the historical container, a transtemporal historical container. So not object-oriented, but are sort of these larger, like expansive containers that are oriented around affective and embodied experiences of objects. Okay, so I'm going to walk through each of those qualities and then give you some examples of what I do to kind of like help illustrate what that all means, you know, when I say like I put things into a container. Social media flattens past, present, and future. In fact, sort of has a way of drowning out everything by a constant alarm bell. That's the language that Jenny Odell uses. So to create a container of expansiveness is to create an environment for archival thinking and feeling. In practice, this means creating programs and content that are anchored in history, providing some sort of historical context on what's happening in the current moment to connect people and how they are engaging in their worlds, in their lived experiences to the past. So historical context in the museum does this. I mean, does it quite well and takes the form of like sometimes lessons from the past as a way to inspire present day conversations through public programs. And I think, you know, what I'm advocating for is a kind of mindfulness in doing this work in the digital content realm. So, so sometimes it's simply just a reminder, like, you know, when you put things into an expansive container, it's just a reminder that, oh, okay, this mental tag, like from historic events that we're going through actually had happened before, gives people a sense of comfort in knowing that they are not alone and that they're experiencing something that belongs to a larger story of humanity. So expansiveness in this case really just relates to how it stretches people's sense of time so then they can feel a longer arc of time connecting to past, present, to the future. And this is critical in a time when our news cycle was moving very, very fast at the increments of seconds. So it advocates for slowing down and reflecting on history that gives people a sense of expansiveness and the space to reclaim humanity. The goal here is to make sense of history while living in it. And in other words, I like to put it this way: how to stand on the shoulders of history while reflecting on history and living in it. I generally take a kind of a 2-point approach. One is to mark the current moment. So finding a way to tag the current moment, creating the now-ness, and then locating that within the larger history. This is a temporary public art exhibit that I created and helped produce at One Archives Foundation in honor of World AIDS Day in December this past year. The exhibit is called It's Not Over, and it focuses on posters and graphics from early AIDS activism. We put together the exhibit. As we were doing so, we realized that there was a remarkable similarity between HIV/AIDS history and what we're seeing now in the COVID-19 pandemic. I designed the exhibit to be experienced outdoor as a month-long public art installation, and there was a web exhibit to be experienced as a companion piece. Healthcare is still a scarcity especially among historically disadvantaged individuals. COVID has disproportionately affected the Black and Brown community, just as HIV and AIDS has done that and has continued to do that. Similar history in HIV and AIDS. There's a similar story in HIV and AIDS. 38 million people are living with HIV globally in 2019. And as we know, it's going on still. It's impacting disproportionately the Black community. As of 2018, 42% of new HIV cases have occurred within the Black community, which makes up only 13% of the US population. The "It's Not Over" message, sort of taking cues from the design of Yoko Ono and John Lennon's protest banner, "War is Over," stresses the diversity of experiences represented through all the selected images, to include many of the small organizations and grassroots organizing efforts to raise awareness about AIDS. And it was really striking as we put up this exhibit in West Hollywood. Many people walking by thought that those signs, the signage that we put up, the picket signs, the protest signs, as well as like flyers and the posters that we put up, they thought that it was about the pandemic. It was about COVID-19. So there is a sort of like multi-perspectival kind of storytelling that reminds people that actually there is a through line, that the history is itself kind of haunting us and happening again through another epidemic. Oh wait, done that already. Move on. Queeriosities is a project that we've launched a couple weeks ago. It's a home archive and storytelling project. We invite our followers and members of the general public to submit photos of an object that they have in their home archive, along with a physical description of an object and a story about it. So this project is meant to heighten the sense of archival feelings that people can experience at home while being in isolation and quarantine. We want to use this as a way to create a sense of queer belonging, especially during the time of quarantine. We've received over 30 submissions so far. They range from DJ event posters to personal items such as a ritual rock, and queer history ephemera, such as, in this case, what I'm showing here, a rainbow flag ornamented with a variety of buttons from various LGBTQ causes. Reparation. Rather than amending historical wrongs, which is kind of the context in which reparation takes place in a policy context, this is about creating a space for conversations, for revisioning history, and that's sort of casting light on perspectives, and especially perspectival biases within historical narratives that illuminates new narratives that uplifts previously erased and overshadowed perspectives. This reparative container is inspired by Eve Sedgwick's idea of reparative reading in her book, Epistemology of the Closet. Eve Sedgwick critiques the notion of a paranoid reading, so talking about this idea of like diagnosing or diagnostic pathological interpretations, a la Freud. Among the critiques that she's noted about social justice issues, it sort of still follows a kind of a paranoia model that she doesn't like, and she offers this idea of reparative reading as an alternative to encourage dialogues that are affirming and affect-centric. The goal here is to create a narrative shift, a narrative change through revisioning history. And this is an invitation to include perspectives that have been historically erased. What happens when we center the story of HIV and AIDS around Black women's experience and their contributions to AIDS activism. This is a question that we provoke in a recent exhibition that we just launched. The HIV and AIDS narrative have not been in the mainstream sort of organized around Black women's experiences and their activism. Metanoia is an exhibit that questions that and speculates the possibility of change through recentering that history. This exhibition takes a different approach in telling stories, anchoring HIV and AIDS as a political agent for change with a focus on transformation. Metanoia itself, as a word, means transformation in Greek. So this whole exhibit really centers around a few sort of women prisoner activists who have taken the initiative to sort of come through this journey of finding out of their own sort of positive status as HIV and AIDS, people who are affected by HIV and AIDS, and then sort of discovering that there are ways that they can help raise the awareness of this condition where their fellow prisoners were dying of AIDS and were untreated and took it upon themselves to organize for treatment and eventually for compassionate release. And in particular, a couple of women's names, Joanne Walker, Katrina Haslip, and this person that's shown here is Joanne Walker, have illustrated that sort of path of transformation. And this transformation of discovery is in fact kind of the way that we have the spirit of the design of this project. We launched recently, as of last week, a web exhibit that started with this provocation, the provocation of imagining a history centering around Black women and their experiences. And the goal of this project is to create feelings of speculation and create a space to imagine doing so with other bodies in presence. And so in the design of this project, we really foreground process, the sort of process of inquiry. Rather than answering questions, we're asking more questions. We're encouraging people to ask more questions. And in terms of the visual design, there's this sort of spacious quality and asymmetry, and all of that is there as a way for us to create a sense of space, to invite inquiries and slow reflections, to encourage people to have a kind of an intimate relationship to historical archival content. Lastly, just want to talk through sort of this notion of collectivity that can be built through rapid reflections. The goal here is to bring together a community through historical reflections in the moment. When COVID-19 happened, we had to close our gallery really quickly. Metanoia was on the wall, and we had to find a way to quickly pivot so that we can continue to engage with our constituents. I had a thought that what if we create a zine, a short form, independent publishing format that can quickly come together to document the initial responses to the pandemic. And so in creating a zine, we saw a community in the making as well. Reached out to the curators of the exhibit. They quickly organized a zine, edited it, and created sort of like this collective response to COVID-19 in the spirit of this exhibit that's still mounted on the wall in our gallery in West Hollywood. The zine centers around the notion of doula as someone who takes care of others during their transition, whether it's between life or death or negative positive status in terms of HIV. And we've realized that there's so much resonance across in our time. This is the cover of the zine. And we've manifested these zines as sort of nuggets of content out in social media as these little tiny squares that we sort of periodically put out. This is yet a second sequel to the zine that we just put out a couple weeks ago that addresses the notion of doula, again, a transition in light of the sort of uprising and protests that have been happening. Here's another spread within the zine talking about the importance of community archives and preserving indigenous voices in the middle of sort of uprising events happening in Minneapolis after the murder of George Floyd. Just one closing thought, actually a couple. Attention metrics determine just how we sell things and how we can build brand awareness. I wonder if there is another kind of metric that can assess the successes of archival goals, like, you know, storytelling. I don't have an answer to this, but I'm asking a question. Jenny Odell talks about the difference between connectivity and sensitivity. Is it possible that we come up with a sensitivity metric that allows readers to grow their LGBTQ history and sensitivity? Knowledge as empathy and empowerment. Next, futurity. Rita Felsky talks about how cultural critiques are backwards gazing. I think, you know, in light of so much of queer studies and theory, there's a whole lot of conversation about how there is, in fact, futurity built into queer cultural production. How do we move our work into the future? How do we store historical content into the future? We're now launching a youth audio project that centers around intergenerational dialogues led by LGBTQ youth. And queer kinship, you know, itself, you know, is a sort of intentional creation. So creating a space for high school students to lead conversations about what's meaningful to them from history is a start of this futurist orientation, I think. Yeah, and that's it. That concludes my presentation, and I look forward to just hearing from you and seeing if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Umi. So we have an immediate question from Beth, and Beth asks, when designing these an exhibits or a presentation like this, what is the relationship between creating spaces for people who see themselves and engage in inquiry and creating spaces for narratives? So people who existing narrative foreground, revising them and engaging in inquiry. Are there a tension between people and narratives? Do you think they're complementary?
Such a good question, Beth. That tension totally exists. There's in design, there's this question about the economy of space, like how do we sort of treat space as for the most part, it's sort of like resources that we invest in. Do we give the space to people? Do we give the space to the content or narratives? Do we give space to some, you know, liminal space in between, some sort of dialogue between the two? I would say within the digital space that I work in, kind of digital exhibition and presentations, for me, the magic happens is the dialectic. You know, it's the sort of, you know, having enough space so then visually people feel like they're, you know, they're in an experience that they can have a kind of an intimate relationship of their own in relation to the content. And so, you know, that's, you know, for us on our part, it's having to make decisions about, you know, where do we arrange, you know, what's the arrangement visually, but also like, you know, I think traditionally museum designs could, you know, kind of place didactic in ways that sort of could be very provocative, but not leaving enough space for people to read into, you know, kind of bring their own histories and lived experience to the objects. And I think, you know, through interaction in a digital environment, there are opportunities for more of that. So I think, you know, I'm seeing some really great examples, like, you know, even just like my last meeting, the last Zoom that I was actually on with the thesis students of MFA students who are in media design, coming up with various interesting ways to approach this using virtual reality technology, you know, creating sort of in situ ways of like examining local knowledge, while being in a space that's sort of both inquiry driven but also local at the same time, to the subjects that are being brought on in history, in narrative.
Great. Katrina, I see that you have unmuted.
Oh, that was an accident. My apologies. But I will say thank you so much so far. This has been absolutely fascinating.
No worries. Thank you.
Eric, I can ask another question if it's okay.
Yeah, please, Brian.
Again, I apologize. Apparently, I didn't word my other question right. So what you answered was really interesting. So I'll ask what I intended to say. What in your exhibits, it seemed like there's a challenge, which is on one hand, you want to foreground people that in the past and for people and perspectives that in the past haven't been foregrounded. And that has an advantage and a power of creating a space for those people. But it also potentially is challenging is not the right word, but it creates a space for the folks that are not those people to also engage in inquiry about their understanding of the history or the events. And I was kind of curious, do you see those two audiences, the folks that are seeing themselves for the first time versus folks that thought it was about them? Are those two audiences in conflict? Are they in tension? No, it's actually the same stuff to get both engaged in inquiry?
Excellent question. Thank you for reiterating your question.
That's
so
okay.
I understand it better.
Yeah, my typing wasn't very good, so it's not your fault.
Yeah, no, I think in uplifting sort of a voice that's historically excluded itself is a challenge. I think, that in itself is a provocation. There is a probing happening, right? Poking at, what we have come to know as common knowledge. And so I think in that space there's a bit of conflict in there, and I think curatorially that's the space that I see as being productive, in a sense that we invite this notion of multiplicity and encourage people to make space for multiplicity, and this is not something that's digestible sometimes. I mean, I think and in fact, I think just by putting up an exhibition, mounting an exhibition on a wall, putting some objects, doesn't really do that. And I think the magic happens is, the dialogue. I think traditionally that happens in public programs, when the curators, sort of have, actually the space to dialogue with people when they ask questions like, well, I never thought that was important. Why are you putting that on the wall? Raising inquiries like that. But I think that in the digital space, there's some potential ways to engage too, and I think sometimes I think having the space in front of a screen could be very personal. I mean, I think a lot of people who are experiencing our exhibit are just using their mobile devices, and they're just scrolling through in their own time, and I think that could sort of alleviate the pressure of like, okay, I'm looking at this new narrative that I hadn't thought of, and I'm not having to explain what I'm looking at next to the person next to me, like like I'm not having to say that to my spouse, like I have this time of my own to explain or to maybe learn from something. But yeah, no, I think sort of the sort of wrestling with the complexity is sort of in our mission now, and I think to me it's about sort of opening up, creating the space, so then there's multiple streams that can kind of come together, but obviously it does require some really active kind of shaping in a dialogue through virtual and in-person programs. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you use a lot of prompts, both digitally and in your exhibits?
Yeah, what I've found very productive lately is sort of rather than using context statements, sort of sets the background, like this is what happened, at this time, and these people did X, Y, Z, like figuring, kind of foregrounding figures, we're using sort of inquiries, we're using questions. Questions rhetorically invite more sort of speculation and more spaces for people to bring in kind of their own imagination of an answer that may be reflective of their lived experience.
Great. Katrina, you now have a question.
Yeah, I had a question. I was just struggling to find the words for it. So in my research, I come from a background in libraries and in digital humanities. And so my research question for one of my main projects started out as being, what does it mean to sustain curated collections over time? It's difficult to do, especially in the case of digital scholarship. These things tend to evaporate on the web very quickly when they're not allied with a sustainable curation institution. But as I've been working with different communities, including, thank you, Beth, for pointing out the Community Archives project I've been working on with the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities. As we've been working together on that collection and doing research on sustainability strategies, the sort of question has become flipped. How do we center the sustainability of collections in communities that create them or that are represented in them or that use them, and vice versa? How do we make collections contribute to the sustainability of those communities? So I'm not sure exactly what my question is, but I think it's something like, is sustainability, is resilience, are these things that you sort of explicitly discuss with the communities you work with? And how do you understand the roles of communities versus curators in those problems?
Yeah, those are really great questions. I'm so glad you're working on it in your thesis. I don't have an answer to that. It does surface as a very common question. I think within the queer archives world, there is a whole lot of community archiving happening. In fact, in our institution now is an institutional sort of like large holdings, started out as being something that lived inside of the founder's home. And it sort of has circulated over the period in lots of people's homes. I think the question is, for us, has sort of drifted from kind of thinking infrastructurally into sort of organizationally. How do we think about this? How do we bring together all of these queer archives? A lot of these are grassroots and small, and some of the bigger ones, so like, how do we bring the two together so that the large doesn't overshadow the small, and that we're in dialogue, and that, I think that there's been conversations about finding aids creations, that sort of like makes, all archives, all sizes discoverable equally. And I think that's sort of like one of the sort of ways to address equity. But that was a project we had anyway. So I think the other question is, sort of going back to like what really matters at the end. Is it the stuff, or is it the people, or is it both, and what's the relationship between the two? I think that we're experimenting with kind of like short form publication, like the zine is sort of an interesting kind of space, is sort of saying, giving people the space to create what matters to them, to kind of add context, so like, if these, zine is something that can be put together really fast. So like, if these XYZ collection items are most important to them, that's given the space to kind of co-curate and co-dialogue. So it's not just us, like, who are sort of professional getting paid to do this, but people who are out there culturally working and involved in supporting communities have, the sort of curatorial power to determine what matters.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We're now at 5 o'clock, so we need to end. Please come back next month. I think we have a speaker switch. I don't actually know who the next month's speaker, and I'll turn it back to Beth. Thank you so much, Dr. Hsu.
Thank you all. It's been great. Hope to connect with you sometime in the future. Take care.
So Beth, do you have anything to?
I sure do. I was trying to find First of all, Brian made me sound very smart today. We're, for some reason, masquerading as Beth 1 and Beth 2. So good questions, Beth / Brian. So next week, next month, we are first Wednesdays at the cafe. That's our series. And Dr. Valeria Rueda is going to speak. And she was nominated by Victoria Van Heining. And she's going to speak on using geographical archival resources for quantitative history, a practitioner's perspective. That's a tongue twister. So that's what we're looking forward to next time. And I want to thank everybody for joining us. And this video will be on the internet within a week or less if you wanted to check it again or send it to somebody that you think that would have enjoyed it. And I thank you so much for coming. All right, everybody.